Something's missing here. No, not here either. Is it this? No, I don't think so. Ah, yes, there it is. That's what I was missing. Welcome to Path of Exile. This is a free ARPG in the same vein as Diablo and Grim Dawn. Developed and produced by Grinding Gear Games, which released about 8 years ago. And when I say free, I mean that the game is entirely free to play and to beat beginning to end. You may want to spend money to expand your stash storage or change your cosmetic options, more on that later, but neither of those are actually required to beat the game. Allow me to begin by stating that there are multiple beginner's guides videos that last at least an hour long. This is not going to be that. Don't expect an entirely in-depth look at how to min-max, the best path to go down when leveling, great skill gems, respectively great support gems, or really any specifics as it relates to endgame mechanics. This is none of that. You begin the game by choosing one of 6 classes. They are, from left to right, the Templar, Shadow, Marauder, Ranger, Duelist, and Witch. There's a 7th class smack dab in the middle, the Scion, which can be unlocked via game progression. Regardless of which class you choose, you always have access to the exact same skill tree, though each class begins at its own point within it. I must say the skill tree is insane. As much as I really love it, it can be fairly overwhelming for a new player. This fairly complicated tree also lends itself to an insane number of possible builds, with a good amount of overlap. That said, if like myself you own 3 separate copies of Final Fantasy X and are familiar with its arguably similar sphere grid system, you'll probably be fine. I would equate the first characters you play as in the game and the first playthrough of it as something of a learning experience. You figure out what works for your character and what playstyles suit you best, and the game's absolutely massive skill tree actively encourages experimentation with whatever your build happens to be. While there are technically limitless builds for your present character, you can feel railroaded into choosing what's considered a technically viable build for whichever class you've chosen. While this does present a clear and precise means of knowing what works through one of Path of Exile's many online resources, it can also be damning for that same experimentation. Also, as a result, if you fuck up a build, the issue becomes either farming for a specific item to partially or fully respec your skill tree, or creating a new character with the same class to take from level 1 forward. While this isn't generally frowned upon by the community within the game, it is still a considerable time sink for someone unfamiliar with the game's mechanics. In addition to sharing the same skill tree, each class also shares in the same skill system. Skills are gems, which can be socketed into the item sockets of your equipment. Shocking, I know. Provided they share the same color, red gems go into red sockets, and so on. This places even more of an emphasis on the importance of gear drops. It even makes common drops important. There are items that directly make those common gear immediately useful, even if they initially don't have the best stats. Skills also have levels separate from the characters, an individual level tied to the specific gem. This could mean that one rolling magma and another are not the same in terms of power. This leveling also means that the stat requirements for a skill gem can change, and the character must meet those requirements before being able to level the gem in the first place. The socket link system is also fantastic, if also a bit complicated. Comparing it to Diablo 3, skills can have unique properties, but outside of modifiers applied by legendary or equivalent gear, the player is restricted to only having one of them. The Necromancer, for example, can have a simulacrum, but they can normally only choose one variant at a time. Now with a set item, they can have all of those at once. They still need that item to do so. While it is possible to expend legendary items in Kanai's Cube to unlock their traits as a selectable permanent passive, they still need the item to do so in the first place. Skill gems, on the other hand, allow mixing and matching of modifiers for abilities with no restrictions for having only one kind, apart from having only one copy of a support skill linked within the same system. You can't have 2 summon phantasm support, for example, even allowing more than one active skill gem in the same system, thus sharing the exact same support skills. The benefit of Diablo's system is lost here, however. The only restriction there is level, as well as the time and effort required to obtain whatever specific item you're gunning for. There are more restrictions in PoE to get the modifiers active, the color of the socket, the links between them, as well as meeting the statistical requirements for all of those gems within the system as well as the equipment they're socketed into. Getting your build optimized how you like can be both a daunting and rewarding task, but once you really start picking up steam you can effectively snowball your way through the game. Looking at various endgame builds on YouTube showcases that. For me, due to my love of Diablo 2's Necromancer, I've always loved playing summoner builds in games like this. As a result, my stupidly named Summoning Witch is hands down my favorite character to play. My proudest moment? When I earned the achievement Behold My Army, attained by having at least 60 minions at the same time. With a sustained skill tree and heavy emphasis on gear, PoE makes intense use of both trademarks of a dungeon crawler. Looting your defeated enemies' decaying bodies, and excessive and steadily increasing numbers by way of optimizing your build. As a result, it makes the player feel like a goddamn powerhouse, and does so fantastically. Every inch of ground you gain is earned through trial of combat. You don't start overpowered, but you will get there. It's the end result that makes the relatively basic gameplay loop enticing. A loop which this title, as I'm sure comes as a shock to no one, follows to a T. Go to a location, murder every living thing inside of that location, pick up the shit they dropped, pawn off that useless shit, keep the useful shit, repeat ad infinitum. Saying that this is all that the game has on offer though would be a major disservice to all involved. There are various layers of complexity, mechanics, and mini-games, most of which admittedly just put a spin or a caveat onto combat in some way, that steadily increases as the game goes on. Delves, incursions, the bestiary, heists, just to name a few. Thankfully, there's a big-ass help button that acts as a new player's best friend should they ever get confused. Some of those mechanics come as a result of the game's league system. A league, more specifically a challenge league, is a special limited time event which can last mere hours to a few months, which on paper acts similarly to Diablo 3's seasons. But they also introduce new mechanics and aspects of the game that change the gameplay in interesting ways as opposed to just a simple ladder. The current league, Scourge, implements a sort of underworld that the player enters into by way of an item called the Blood Crucible, which itself must be filled with a resource that steadily increases with each enemy killed. While they're in this kind of inverse raid class for a limited time, the more enemies they kill, the more corruption grows in whatever item they happen to have residing in their Blood Crucible. When an item is corrupted successfully, it becomes rare if it was common before, with corresponding modifiers, as well as one major beneficial and one major detrimental modifier. This mechanic also has its own leveling, separate from the level of the character or any of their skills. Occasionally, developers may even add these league-specific mechanics into the base game, like the recent Expedition League. Each league also comes with its own music and locations, both of which are fairly varied already within the core game. The music is especially nice, I've found. Thankfully, you can gain access to the entire soundtrack as well as any and all music that gets added in later on by purchasing a supporter pack. While you're in this shop, you might notice that some of these microtransactions are fairly expensive. Some of the supporter packs, for instance, can run you hundreds of dollars. There are also microtransactions that increase storage space within your stash as well as item-specific stash tabs, though if you've bought them, then chances are you're a person who either wants to or already has invested a significant amount of time in this game. And thankfully you don't need either to play the game beginning to end. Speaking of playing, this may rub some people the wrong way, but Path of Exile is an online-only game, even when playing solo self-found characters. A solo self-found character, by the way, is one who has no ability to do effectively anything that an online game would normally grant them. No partying or trading with other players, for example. No offline play here, and unfortunately one can definitely expect lag. I can't recommend anyone play a hardcore character, which is a character with permadeath enabled for this reason. Online play comes with its own benefits though. Playing with other people increases both difficulty and rewards. This only applies while they're in the same area, and loot drops are shared. No instance loot like you'd find in Diablo or Borderlands. Every location you enter is treated as an instance, and you can forcibly reset that instance by clicking on it while in the map. Doubly, due to the way that the game's instances work, if you respawn during a boss fight, their health will remain at the same level it was when you died as long as you re-enter the boss arena within a specific time frame after your death. 10 minutes, if I remember correctly. This allows you a brief time to re-strategize before heading back in, for example returning to town via a portal scroll, equipping new skills, and coming back, or returning immediately to beat the boss to death through sheer force of will matched only by your own stubbornness to refuse a change in strategy. After partying up with a friend for a time, chances are you'll need to sell off the shit gear you picked up that they didn't. Thankfully, every act within the game has its own base of operations that houses a few vendors, none of which can say no to whatever you're selling. Unless, of course, it's a stolen item from a heist, in which case a specific vendor within the rogue's hideout can buy it off of you. You might notice that there's no singular currency within the game, no gold or silver or shit like that. The game's economy works on bartering. Unfortunately, you don't get to decide what you're trading for, though. Well, that's not entirely true. Vendors do have something of a recipe list, wherein trading certain items or combinations of items results in other specific items. For example, trading a Gemcutter's Prism alongside a level 20 skill gem to a vendor results in obtaining the same skill gem at level 1, but with 20% quality. The online trading primarily uses items called Chaos Orbs as the currency, though, and no such recipe list for that aspect of trading exists. Though there is a website you can go to that helps you find specific items you're looking for from online item sellers. Online or off, this game has a rich lore in its relatively long playtime, relatively being the operative term. The game is split into 2 parts with 5 acts each, but I guarantee you there's someone out there who's beat it in under 2 hours. Most of this lore is presented through admittedly well voice-acted text dumps with you just standing around, listening to an NPC talk. Unless it's a journal or something like it in the game world, in which case you can walk around while listening, but that audio can get drowned out by the sounds of combat, which there will be a lot of. I didn't find myself emotionally invested in the game's characters, though conceptually I did find the story itself interesting. Side note, talking to a specific NPC once you find her will unlock a quest that allows you to get a hideout at its end. Personally, I love this. Giving me a customizable home base is excellent. I love the hideout system. Now that I've covered most of the other aspects of the game, I should talk about the bread and butter for dungeon crawlers of this genre, the combat. Mobility is fairly important, as are the flasks you have equipped. Unlike Diablo, I know, I keep bringing it up. Flasks can have their own specific modifiers beyond just this heals or this makes me faster, which also places even more importance on item prioritization and strategy with specific flask loadouts. Having one that increases evasion or armor is generally a smart move, but if you'd prefer one that also prevents specific ailments for a brief period of time, then you have to either hunt for it or re-roll its modifiers using an item. The game's difficulty also seems to ramp up fairly quickly, especially around the 4th act. Up until then, no boss had killed me. The boss here killed me multiple times. As is the nature for a game in this genre, late game enemies are liable to punish the unprepared. Whether or not this is a result of poor stats or gear doesn't really matter, you'll die regardless. This makes beating difficult, unique enemies immensely rewarding. Kicking the ass of those who once kicked yours is always a satisfying feeling. Path of Exile is an excellent entry into the ARPG genre, whose aesthetics more closely resemble the dungeon crawlers of yesterday than their direct competitors. Its surface level complexity can be off-putting to newcomers, but for those who dig deep enough, they'll find even more complex and ultimately more rewarding mechanics that will constantly keep them both entertained and striving for ever more threatening foes. This is a game I can easily recommend to fans of the genre, and thanks to its incredible price tag of literally nothing, there's no harm in simply trying it. There's a very real part of me that hurts to admit this, but I prefer Path of Exile to Diablo 3. Diablo 2 will always hold a large part of my heart and unnumbered hours of my youth. And nothing can replace that, but over time, I think I just prefer Path of Exile. Story out.
Still, it's a good place to swashbuckle and make love to a bawdy, buxom bunter out back of a boozy bar.